Okay, so the definition of building is sort of like bathroom, where you would think it's a very simple definition, but there's actually a bit more to it than you might initially think. So when we look at the definition, a building is a structure that stands alone, which is simple enough, or that's separated from adjoining structures by firewalls. Okay, so looking at this photograph, I was walking through Phoenix one day, and I saw this building, and of course I couldn't get my camera out of my pocket fast enough, you know, for an electrical nerd like me, these receptacles with their, you know, their headbands and everything else on. So if we look at it, these stores here, and I think, you know, there's a restaurant, a shoe store, and what have you, these are all connected to each other. So is that entire structure one building, or is it multiple buildings that are separated by firewalls? The fact is, it could be either. I would be willing to bet that it's one building and that it is not separated by firewalls. Now, it could be separated by walls that have a fire rating. And not all fire resistance rated assemblies are fire walls. In the International Building Code, we have fire partitions, we have fire barriers, we have fire walls, we have smoke partitions, smoke barriers. So there are a lot of different walls that have various ratings. But a firewall is a very specific type of wall. Most walls that we run into that have a fire resistance rating are not firewalls. Firewalls are pretty uncommon. In the building code, where you would use a firewall is usually because you have a building that's so large that you need to actually separate it into multiple buildings in order to meet the allowable height and area restrictions in the building code. So firewalls are really not as common as a person might think. I would be willing to bet that this is one building and it is not separated by firewalls. That's usually the same thing when we look at townhouses and multifamily dwellings. So again, it's a structure that stands alone or is separated by adjoining structures by firewalls. Usually, the wall that separates the dwellings are not firewalls. So this is probably a single building, not multiple buildings. We also have a definition of structure, and this used to be the simplest definition in the entire code. It used to just say anything that is built or constructed. And that was the definition of a structure. In fact, it said that which is built or constructed. Now it says anything that's built or constructed other than equipment. So looking at this photograph here, it's a classroom. This is a structure, and it is also a building. No question about that. But if we look at these two things, I don't want to assign them a noun yet, this transformer and this power pedestal, are these buildings? No. No question those are not buildings. Nobody's going to argue that. Were they structures 10 years ago? Yes. Yeah, we would call these structures years ago because it's built or constructed. Like somebody built the transformer. Somebody built this pedestal. So these were structures up until, I want to say, the 2017 code, when they made the change saying anything built or constructed other than equipment. Well, these are electrical equipment. So they're not buildings and they're not structures. They're just pieces of electrical equipment. Where this can get a little bit dicey is when you have kind of a combination of both. What we're looking at here in the photograph is not solely electrical equipment, is it? Certainly you have the panel board, or it looks like a panel board and a metering center, CT enclosure, panel board and metering center. That is all electrical equipment. So is the conduit feeding it, but it is supported by a structure. So this would be equipment supported by a structure. Now, where do we need to know the definitions of buildings and structures and things like that? Well, it gets important in Article 230, in 230.2, where it says any building or structure can only be supplied by one service. And then we have kind of the feeder version of that rule, feeder and branch circuit, in Part 2 of Article 225. I think it starts at 225.30. and says that any building or structure can only be supplied by one feeder or one branch circuit. And of course there's exceptions to those. And perhaps most importantly, 250.32 talks about the earth grounding requirements when we have a building or structure supplied by a feeder circuit. So if I have a detached garage, for example, that's both a building and a structure. So if we supply it with electricity, we know we can only supply it with one circuit, right? That's either 230.2 or 225.30. So we can only supply it with one circuit. And 225.30a tells, or pardon me, 250.30a gives us the grounding and bonding rules. And it says, look, if you supply a structure with a feeder circuit, then you have to supply a grounding electrode system at that structure. So if you're feeding a detached garage with a feeder, then you're going to have a grounding electrode system at that garage. There is an exception that says if you're supplying a building or structure with just a single circuit, that you do not need to have a grounding electrode system, but you would still need to have the disconnecting means and everything that Part 2 of Article 225 requires. So the definition of building or structure, it's sometimes important. Where this really stemmed from, the change to clarify that a structure does not include equipment, it was really driven by RV parks. In 551.71, I believe, maybe it's 70, it says that if you have an RV park and you've got a whole bunch of these little pedestals everywhere, well, prior to 2017, these were all structures, weren't they? So you'd have an RV park with, 20, 25 different structures. And of course, you're supplying those structures with a feeder circuit. And that meant you had to have a grounding electrode system at each one of those. You would have to have, 2 ground rods or show less than 25 ohms. And they made a change in both 551.71 to say that we don't really need to do that. That's really not worth the time and effort. But they not only changed it there specifically, but also changed it in a general sense here in Article 100. So if I have a freestanding piece of switchgear out in a parking lot, for example, if I supplied that with a feeder, would I need to drive a ground rod at that equipment? Well, prior to 2017, the answer was yes, because you supplied a structure with a feeder circuit. But now, 2017 and onward, we do not call individual equipment a structure.